While fishing at his remote Minnesota cabin, John saw something move at the tree line. A bobcat, wounded, wild, and watching him. Limping, desperate but unafraid, John shared his catch with the injured animal. What started as a simple act of kindness turned into something extraordinary. The bobcat began bringing gifts of sticks, bottles, and feathers, each offering carefully placed like a tribute of gratitude. As weeks turned into months, the bobcat suddenly vanished. John followed the tracks into the woods and stumbled onto a secret he could not ignore. And just when it seemed over, the bobcat returned with something so precious it brought tears to a man who thought he had nothing left to lose. Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. The sun broke in shards across Mirror Lake, painting golden ribbons on the water's surface as John Mitchell settled into his weathered camping chair. At 72, his hands still knew the weight of a fishing rod like they knew the weight of memories. Both carried with practiced ease, both heavier than they appeared. The rod in his grip was the same Fenwick he'd bought in 1969, just before shipping out to Vietnam. Back then, he'd promised himself he'd catch a trophy bass with it when he got home. 53 years later, he was still keeping that promise, one cast at a time. The wooden cabin behind him, nestled among the towering pines of northern Minnesota, had been his grandfather's before it became his refuge. After Margaret passed 3 winters ago, the solitude that once felt oppressive had transformed into something resembling peace. The lake didn't ask questions. The fish didn't care about the tremor in his left hand or the nightmares that still visited some nights. John cast his line with the fluid motion of someone who could perform the action blindfolded. The lure arced through the morning air, landing with a soft plop near a fallen log where the big ones liked to hide. He'd been working this spot for a week now, certain there was a largemouth down there worth his patience. That's when he first saw it. The movement in his peripheral vision was wrong. Too deliberate to be wind, too large to be a raccoon. John turned slowly, a lifetime of learned caution controlling his muscles. 20 feet away, partially hidden behind a cluster of serviceberry bushes, crouched a bobcat. John's breath caught. In 40 years of fishing this lake, he'd seen plenty of wildlife. Black bears, deer, even a moose once, but never a bobcat this close. The animal was magnificent in its wildness, with tufted ears alert and amber eyes that held an intelligence that made John's skin prickle. But something was off. The cat's left shoulder sat at an odd angle, and dark stains matted the fur along its flank. "Easy there," John murmured, though he knew the sound of his voice would likely send the animal fleeing. Instead, the bobcat remained still, watching him with an intensity that felt almost deliberate. John noticed the labored rise and fall of its chest, the way it kept its weight off its left front paw. The standoff lasted maybe 30 seconds, though it felt like minutes, before the bobcat turned and melted back into the forest with a pronounced limp. John's hands shook slightly as he reeled in his line. He'd seen enough wounded creatures, both human and animal, to recognize suffering when he saw it. That afternoon, John couldn't concentrate on fishing. His mind kept returning to those amber eyes, the matted fur, the obvious pain in the animal's movement. As a young man in the Mekong Delta, he'd learned that suffering ignored had a way of haunting you. By evening, he'd made a decision. He cleaned the 2 small bass he'd caught, setting aside half the meat on a flat stone near the edge of the clearing where he'd seen the bobcat. It was probably foolish. Wildlife biologists would certainly say so. But John had learned to trust his instincts about creatures in need. The next morning, the fish was gone. John found himself looking for the bobcat as he fished, and just before noon, he spotted it again. The cat emerged from the same cluster of bushes, moving with that same painful deliberation. This time, though, it carried something in its mouth. A thick branch, gnarled and weathered. The bobcat placed it carefully about 10 feet from John's chair, then retreated to watch from the bushes. "Well, I'll be damned," John whispered. He left more fish that evening, along with some bread crusts from his sandwich. By the third day, a pattern had emerged. John would leave food. The bobcat would take it and return with something. A plastic water bottle one day, a mud-caked child's toy truck another. The offerings were always placed in the same spot, like tributes at an altar. "Buddy," John said on the 5th day, when the bobcat appeared with an old leather glove in its teeth. "That's what I'm going to call you, buddy. Though I suspect you might be a lady, given your size." As a wildlife rehabilitator would tell you, bobcats are solitary creatures, fiercely independent and typically avoiding human contact at all costs. What was happening between John and this injured cat defied conventional understanding of the species. But then, John reflected, trauma had a way of rewriting the rules for all creatures. By the second week, Buddy had grown bolder, sometimes remaining visible while eating the fish John left. The limp was improving slightly, though John could see the shoulder was likely dislocated rather than broken. Painful but survivable if the cat could avoid infection and find enough food. That's where John came in. He'd taken to catching extra fish specifically for Buddy, sometimes keeping only one small base for himself and leaving the rest for his unusual friend. The gifts continued too. Feathers, pine cones, once a muddy baseball that must have been lost in the woods for years. John collected them all, arranging them on a shelf in his cabin he'd come to think of as Buddy's gallery. "My therapist would have a field day with this," John muttered one evening, placing a particularly large crow feather among the collection. He'd stopped seeing Dr. Patterson a year ago, confident he'd made as much progress as he was going to make. But this strange communion with a wounded wild animal felt like a different kind of therapy altogether. 3 weeks into their routine, John caught the biggest bass he'd seen in years. Nearly 6 pounds of fighting muscle that took 15 minutes to land. As he held it up, admiring the green bronze flanks that gleamed in the afternoon sun, he made a decision that would have horrified his younger self. He kept only enough for a single meal, leaving the rest, nearly 4 pounds of prime fish, for Buddy. The bobcat must have sensed something special about this offering. Instead of taking it and disappearing as usual, Buddy sat at the edge of the clearing and ate while John watched from his chair. It was the closest they'd been, maybe 12 feet, and John could see details he'd missed before. The distinctive black markings on the backs of the ears, the white patches on the face, the way the stub tail twitched with what almost looked like contentment. "You're welcome," John said softly, and could have sworn Buddy slow blinked at him, the feline equivalent of a smile. October arrived with a rush of cold air and painted leaves. John had started wearing his heavy flannel jacket for morning fishing, and Buddy's coat had grown thicker in preparation for winter. The shoulder seemed fully healed now, though Buddy still walked with a slight favoring of that leg that would probably be permanent. A bobcat that couldn't hunt at full capacity wouldn't last long in the wild, John knew. But Buddy had adapted, and more importantly, had found a reliable food source in John's daily catches. Then came the morning when Buddy didn't appear. John waited through breakfast, lunch, and into the afternoon. No movement in the serviceberry bushes, no gifts left at the usual spot. By evening, a cold dread had settled in his stomach, a familiar feeling from nights on patrol when something felt wrong, but you couldn't say what. The next morning, still no Buddy. John barely touched his coffee, his mind racing through possibilities. Had the bobcat's injury finally become infected? Had it ventured too far and couldn't make it back? Or worse, John's jaw tightened. Had someone else discovered Buddy's presence? Unable to sit still any longer, John grabbed his walking stick and headed into the woods. He knew Buddy generally came from the northeast, where the forest grew thick with undergrowth. As he picked his way through the brambles, memories of jungle patrols flickered unbidden through his mind. Different forest, same hypervigilance. Near a small clearing about a quarter-mile from his cabin, movement caught his eye. But it wasn't Buddy. It was a man in camouflage, carrying a rifle and what looked like a pole with a loop on the end. A trapper's tool. John's blood ran cold. He shifted behind a large oak, watching as the man checked something on the ground. A trap, from the look of his movements. Minnesota had strict regulations about trapping, and bobcat season didn't open until December. This was a poacher. Following at a distance, John watched the man check several trap sites. At the fourth one, John's worst fears materialized. There was Buddy, left front paw caught in the steel jaws of a foothold trap, eyes wide with pain and fear. The poacher approached with the control pole, and John saw him pull out a cloth bag. Not the quick dispatch a legal trapper would perform, but preparation for live capture. The illegal fur trade, John realized with disgust. Some people paid enormous sums for exotic pets or pelts taken outside of season when the fur was still prime. John watched, fury building, as the man managed to get Buddy into a wire cage, the bobcat yowling in protest and pain. The sound tore at something in John's chest. He followed as the poacher loaded the cage into an ATV and drove deeper into the woods. 20 minutes later, they arrived at a rundown cabin that made John's place look like a mansion. The poacher disappeared inside for a moment, then returned to carry Buddy's cage into what looked like an old barn. John crept closer, using skills he hadn't employed in 50 years. Through a gap in the barn's siding, he saw something that made his stomach turn. Cages lined the walls, at least a dozen. He could make out the forms of several raccoons, what looked like a fox, and in the far corner, another bobcat. All illegal, all destined for black market sales. John backed away carefully, pulling out his cell phone when he was far enough away. The 911 dispatcher transferred him to the Department of Natural Resources emergency line. He gave them the GPS coordinates, described what he'd seen, and was told officers would respond within the hour. But an hour was too long. John had seen Buddy's injured paw in that trap, seen the terror in those amber eyes. If the authorities took Buddy, even in a rescue, the cat would go to a rehabilitation facility. With that permanent limp, Buddy would likely be deemed non-releasable. And non-releasable bobcats that couldn't be placed in educational programs were typically euthanized. John made another decision that Dr. Patterson would have called processing trauma through action. Others might have called it breaking and entering. The poacher had left, probably to check more trap lines. John approached the barn, finding the door secured with only a simple padlock. His lock-picking skills were rusty, but a padlock was a padlock, whether on a barn in Minnesota or a supply shed in Da Nang. Inside, the smell hit him first. Fear and feces and desperation. The animals cowered in their cages, except for Buddy, who perked up at John's approach. "Hey there, friend," John whispered, working at the simple latch on Buddy's cage. "Let's get you out of here." Buddy's paw was swollen but not broken. The trap had been padded, probably to avoid damage to valuable pelts. As soon as the cage opened, Buddy bolted for the door, pausing only to look back at John once before disappearing into the forest. John quickly opened the other cages too, watching as raccoons and the fox scattered into the woods. The other bobcat hesitated longest, finally slinking out with a hiss in John's direction. He was back at his own cabin, trying to look like he'd been there all along, when the DNR officers arrived 40 minutes later. They found the poacher returning to a barn full of empty cages and evidence of wildlife trafficking. John gave his statement about what he'd witnessed, carefully omitting his rescue mission. "Strangest thing," one officer told John later. "All the cages were open when we got there. Guy swears he left them locked, but with all the evidence we found, he's looking at serious federal charges regardless." John nodded sympathetically, accepting the officer's thanks for the tip. For 3 days, John didn't see Buddy. He left fish anyway, which disappeared overnight, but he couldn't be sure who was taking them. On the 4th morning, though, he found a gift at the usual spot. A perfect blue jay feather, brilliant in the morning sun. That afternoon, Buddy appeared, favoring the trapped paw but otherwise seeming no worse for wear. John had never been so happy to see anyone, human or otherwise. "Tough as nails, aren't you?" he said, setting out an especially large portion of bass. "Just like some other survivors I know." As October turned to November, John noticed changes in Buddy's gifts. Instead of random forest debris, the bobcat had started bringing prey. A freshly caught mouse one day, a squirrel the next. The rehabilitation was complete, John realized. Buddy could hunt again. "Don't need me anymore, do you?" John said one afternoon, watching Buddy devour a fish while a perfectly good rabbit lay at the gift spot. "Just coming for the company now?" If bobcats could shrug, John imagined Buddy would have. December arrived with the first serious snowfall. John had to break ice on the lake's edge to fish some mornings, but he persisted. Buddy appeared less frequently now, sometimes going 3 or 4 days between visits. John told himself this was good, natural, the way things should be. A wild bobcat shouldn't be dependent on humans. Still, he worried during the longer absences. Had Buddy ventured into another trapper's territory? Minnesota's legal bobcat season was open now, and while Buddy stayed mostly in the protected area around John's cabin, bobcats could range for miles. Just before Christmas, Buddy disappeared for a full week. John left fish that froze solid before something, probably raccoons, took them. On the 8th day, he was genuinely considering searching the woods again when he heard a sound on his porch that made him abandon his morning coffee. There sat Buddy, but not alone. 2 smaller forms huddled against her. John had been right about the gender. Their spotted coats fluffed against the cold. Kittens, probably 3 months old, just old enough to travel with their mother but still dependent on her hunting. "Well, I'll be damned," John breathed, standing frozen at his window. Buddy looked directly at him through the glass, those amber eyes carrying something that looked almost like pride. She had brought him many gifts over the months, branches and bottles, feathers and prey. But this, John understood, was the ultimate show of trust. She had brought her most precious possessions to meet the strange human who had helped her when she couldn't help herself. John moved slowly to his freezer, pulling out the last of yesterday's catch, 3 good-sized crappies. He opened the door carefully, setting the fish on the porch before retreating inside. Through the window, he watched Buddy nose the fish toward her kittens, who attacked them with the enthusiasm of young predators still learning their trade. While they ate, Buddy maintained her position between them and the door, protective but calm. "Your babies are beautiful," John said softly through the glass. "You did good, Buddy. You did real good." As winter deepened, Buddy continued to bring the kittens by every few days. John learned to recognize them individually. The larger one with the bold personality he called Brave, and the smaller, more cautious one he dubbed Careful. He never tried to approach them, never tried to tame them. He had learned from Buddy that the gift wasn't in the possession, but in the trust, in the strange bridge that could form between two damaged souls who chose to help each other heal. By spring, the kittens were hunting on their own, though they still accompanied their mother on her visits to John's cabin. He had expanded his fishing efforts, making sure to always have enough for his unusual family of bobcats. The DNR officers who occasionally checked in, John had become something of a local hero for exposing the poaching ring, would have been horrified. But John figured some rules were meant to be bent when the bending served a greater purpose. One warm May morning, nearly a year after that first encounter, John sat in his usual chair, rod in hand, when all three bobcats emerged from the forest together. They didn't come for fish. John could see the remains of a successful hunt in their satisfied movements. Instead, Buddy approached closer than she ever had, settling herself just 6 feet from John's chair. The kittens played in the clearing, pouncing on grasshoppers and wrestling with the boundless energy of young predators. John understood this visit was different. This was a goodbye, or at least a see you later. The kittens were old enough now to disperse, to find their own territories. Buddy herself might range farther, following prey patterns or seeking a new mate. The daily visits would likely end, replaced by occasional appearances if John was lucky. "You take care of yourself," John said quietly. "All of you. And know you're always welcome here." Buddy slow blinked at him once more, then rose and walked back toward the forest. The kittens followed, Brave leading the way, with Careful taking one last look back at the old man in the chair. John watched until they disappeared into the shadows between the trees, then turned back to his fishing. His hands were steady on the rod, steadier than they'd been in years. The tremor that had plagued him since Vietnam seemed to have quieted, soothed by months of this strange, healing routine. 3 days later, John found a gift at the usual spot. Not prey this time, but a single perfect pine cone, its scales tight and symmetrical. He added it to Buddy's gallery in his cabin, right next to the first gnarled branch she'd brought him. He still fishes every morning, weather permitting. He still leaves the occasional fish at the edge of the clearing, though it might be days or weeks between Buddy's visits now. Sometimes she comes alone, sometimes with new kittens. He's seen 2 more litters in the years since that first healing season. The locals have started calling him the Bobcat Whisperer, though John just shrugs when they ask about it. Nothing mystical about it, he tells them. Just 2 old survivors looking out for each other. But late at night, when his dreams turn dark and the old memories creep in, John thinks about amber eyes and unusual gifts, about trust earned through patience and kindness, about the healing that comes from helping another wounded soul. He thinks about Buddy out there in the darkness, probably teaching new kittens to hunt, carrying on with the fierce resilience that defines both bobcats and the humans who are privileged to know them. The tremor in his hand is gone for good now. The nightmares, while not vanished, come less frequently. And every morning, when John checks the spot where Buddy leaves her gifts, he's reminded that sometimes the most profound connections come from the most unexpected places. Sometimes healing has 4 legs, tufted ears, and eyes that see right through to your soul. Sometimes the best therapy comes not from talking about your wounds, but from quietly tending to another's. On his cabin wall, beside the photographs of Margaret and his army buddies, hangs a picture someone from the DNR took. A blurry shot of Buddy sitting in John's clearing, looking directly at the camera with those knowing amber eyes. Below it, John has written a simple caption: "The friend who brought me back." And in the woods around Mirror Lake, a bobcat with a slight limp and a fierce spirit continues to thrive. Her territory overlapping with that of an old fisherman who understands that sometimes the wildest creatures are the ones who teach us how to be human again.